there. We're live on Facebook doing the M&C Move the Stairs Friday chat, where we talk strategy and brand protection for your biggest PR challenges. And man, do we have a big one today. So we are so excited to be here. We're going to be talking about Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, the controversy between wearing masks, not wearing masks, mandates, all the things that are going on with that. And the reality is that your employees, your clients, your customers, they're all having their voices heard. The question is, what should they be hearing from your business? So, Sarah, do you want to talk a little bit about what we're going to do over the next hour?
Certainly. I'm just doing all of the back end stuff here, so forgive me on doing all of this work to get us live. But I want to, like we do every week, we work through 4 topics. In the first 15 minutes, we're going to talk about what should I do during this time? What happens if I do nothing? At 15 minutes, we're going to talk about the best advice that we found from communication experts on what is and isn't appropriate. At 30 minutes, we're going to talk about walking the walk, right? Not just talking the talk, and looking inside your own organization to make sure that everything is aligned the way it really ought to be. And to round out the hour, we're going to be talking about doing your own work personally to make sure that you are authentic when you are talking the talk.
So by the end of this, you're going to have a really good example and a great understanding of why this topic matters, why it's so important, where your business and your brand stands on this topic, and you'll have some examples of best practices of some other top brands who have done this really, really well.
So if you're joining us on Facebook, please jump into the conversation. We're looking forward to your comments. If you're watching this later, just send us an email. We'd love to hear your questions, hear your comments, discussion points. If we don't get to answer it, we'll answer you immediately. But we'll also talk about that next week in the Move the Stairs chat. Now, without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Michele Hanna, who is a dear friend of mine. Hi, Michele. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Fine, thanks. Tell us a little bit about you.
I am Michele Hanna. I'm on faculty at the Graduate School of Social Work. I've been there since a long time.
None of us already go into that part, Michele.
Yeah, I've been there a while. My area of expertise, as far as my research is concerned, is primarily in child welfare, foster and adoptive parents, children, anything related to child welfare. However, I also I teach and oversee our child welfare concentration. I also oversee 2 huge grants that we have to improve the workforce in integrated behavioral health and substance use workforce, substance use prevention, treatment, and recovery. I always forget my little trio. So I kind of have my feet in both of those. But I also teach several of our classes that are related to cultural competency and cultural humility. I've developed and taught several of those classes over the last, I'd say 6-7 years, maybe longer. And so I do that, and I've done training in that area for quite a long time.
Well, Michele, we're so glad to have your expertise on this discussion today. You probably know this, but we try to move the stairs, which means that we look at a situation. What are the parameters surrounding that situation? Instead of saying, if only, or, oh God, if this was different, try to be as creative as possible within what we're given. And that's called moving the stairs. And it comes very quickly from a situation I was in where we were covering a politician, and I needed to get that interview first right after he did his acceptance speech, and the stairs led to my competition. So I went to the podium, I unhooked the stairs, I moved him to the other side of the podium, and lo and behold, he walked straight to my people for the interview, which was great. So we moved the stairs. In life, we try to move the stairs, and at M&C, that's really important. And we're trying to do that a little bit today. And Michele and I know each other from working with a nonprofit on child welfare. But one of the reasons I really wanted you to talk today, Michele, is because you and I spent days, weeks, I don't remember how many, in a car together, traveling the United States, interviewing people. We actually ended up next to Davy Crockett's homestead. I remember it was crazy. But one of our big things that we talked about was race. And it was one of the most enlightening and fascinating times for me to hear your perspective. And I think also it was great for you, if I can speak for you for a minute, to have this kind of a conversation with me as well. And so that informed me somewhat. But I still have a long way to go. And I think a lot of us over the past couple weeks have realized how far we still have to go. So let's start with talking about not saying anything. When you don't say anything, what are you really saying? And I think that, I was watching an interview with Robyn D'angelo, who is the writer of White Fragility, and talking about that there's a status quo. And the status quo is institutional racism. It does not mean that we're bad people. It means that we were raised a certain way with certain ideas, and that if you don't say anything, then that kind of means that you're still in that same place. Talk to us a little bit about that. What do you think about that?
Well, my first reaction is if you don't say anything, you're saying everything. It's like, if you see something and you see something going on and you're aware and you're paying attention and you care about these things and you're interested in making change, to be silent and to not say anything is to perpetuate it. It's to continue it. A lot of times people don't say anything out of fear of saying the wrong thing.
Yes, exactly.
And I feel like there is definitely a wrong thing. I'm not going to say that there isn't, but the majority of the people who are thinking about it are not going to say the wrong thing because they're thinking about it. So it's usually the ones who say the wrong thing are the ones that are they're not thinking about it. They really don't. It's not important to them. They really don't buy into the need to address these issues. Another thing, you were talking about our conversations. One of the big things, and I've heard Robyn D'angelo speak, and I've read her book, and I use part of it in my classes. But one of the big things that she talks about is we have to be ready to talk about this. We have to have these conversations. And if you're not willing to enter into the conversation, then you're not open to having that conversation. And that means putting down your defenses. That means hearing, listening, and being able to have direct conversation about what is and is not going on, and then being able to take that and adjust and adapt. And so if you're not willing to open your mouth and speak, then yeah, you're definitely perpetuating what is going on.
I'd like to jump in here really quickly. And I'm thinking of an old adage, which is, a closed mouth gathers no feet. So I'm wondering about the difference between silence in the face of an injustice, where you're not speaking out about something that's happening right in front of you, versus the silence of saying, I'm not sure about this. I don't understand fully my thought process or your experience in this, and I'm processing. Is there a difference in silence, do you think?
That's an interesting question. I mean, so initially when you said that, the first thought I had was there is speaking out when you're, I think about the George Floyd incident. They're speaking out when you see it. So I think about the young lady who took the video. She was speaking out as she saw it. And then you think about the silence of the officers who didn't do anything. That's one thing. When it's happening, it's right there in front of you. And then there's the when that's not. So when you're in a room where you don't actually see it, but there's a discussion about it or something's going on, do you or do you not speak up? So we talk a lot about being an ally, and in my mind, being an ally it costs you something. You have to be willing to speak up when you see it, but you also have to be willing to speak up when there's no one in the room to see you speaking up or to see it. So that was the first thought that I had. The other piece, what you said is, you're contemplating, you're thinking whether or not I should do this or that. It goes back to whether or not it's a right or a wrong thing. I mean, I think we should all think before we open our mouths. I mean, I think my mother taught me that. I mean, most of us, we have a contemplation, but you also don't want to be in this case where you are contemplating for so long that it becomes inaction. It becomes, you become frozen, for lack of a better term, but you do nothing. So you have to be able to contemplate a little faster and process a little faster, and not allow that to be the excuse. Because depending on the situation, depending on who's there, if you say something and it's not 100% correct or it's error, someone should help. That should open the door for others to help you make those adjustments, if you understand what I'm saying.
Sure.
And you're not, we have to be willing to make mistakes. This ability to become culturally competent, to have cultural humility, to be able to be responsive to what is going on around us comes with practice. It's just like anything else. You have to practice, you make mistakes, you learn from your mistakes. And that's how you get better at it.
So it's not, what I'm seeing for businesses right now is that it's Black Lives Matter, but we've also been through this with Me Too. And for the women that are watching us, that is my more comfortable place because I understand that perspective, Michele. Is that fair to kind of pull on that experience and say, this isn't, certainly not walking in the shoes of a Black person, but the prejudice is somewhat analogous. Is that fair?
Well, if that's what so again, if that's what it takes to help you come to the table, that's fine. But then you have to move past that.
Right.
So it's like, it's empathy, right? It's being able to have empathy with what is going on around you. But then you have to move past that. And I think sometimes the error that I see is I've done a lot of training over my years with cultural competency training, working with African American families, individuals, working, racial injustice work. And inevitably, you'll have a white woman who says, well, I know how it feels like because I'm a white woman. And that would be an idea,
that would be an error.
Example of not the right thing, because you want to think that through. You have empathy. You can connect on that level, but you don't know what it feels like.
You don't get, yes.
Yeah, and
absolutely.
So it's kind of like that experience can help you have empathy, and it can help you to ask questions and can help you to grow, but don't hold on to that experience and hold it up as this is why. You do understand what I'm saying? This is why.
This is why.
And
right. But if it can help you move forward so that you can be more open-minded, then maybe that's a pathway.
Right. It can be a pathway to growth for sure.
Okay.
But you have to move past that.
Great. Now, Jordan, we're also talking about the culture changing with masks. It's kind of a hard turn, but at the same time, business owners, bless their hearts, are dealing with all of these things. So talk to us a little bit about what we've learned there, because with the mandate yesterday, business owners are going to have to deal with this in their places of business, whether people feel that they're being imposed upon that they have to wear it, imposed upon wearing it. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, first of all, it can be really confusing because M&C, we're located here in Colorado. So yesterday, if you watched the news, I'm sure you saw the Governor Polis did issue that statewide mask order. So if you're inside and you're 11 years or older, you have to wear a mask. There are some exceptions for that, but Many states are still kind of relying on city, town, countywide to make those decisions. So first of all, you have that confusion. But if you are in a state that has that and is enforcing that mask wearing order, and you're a business owner, you have to decide, how are you going to enforce wearing those masks? Is it going to be a zero tolerance policy? Are you going to have a 3 strike and you're out kind of policy between your guests and your customers? And how are you going to enforce that policy so that it's literally crystal clear? There is no questions asked that if you step into this establishment, you're expected to wear a mask. Now, I think a really interesting point here is some of the exceptions to this rule, and it's going to be different no matter where you live. But here in Colorado, there was a case down here in Colorado Springs where a disabled veteran, he was injured in combat, could not wear a face mask, and he had been kicked out of a couple of different places in Colorado Springs, and that made national headlines because he physically couldn't wear it. So I think it's part one is having that policy in place, and part two is having the training for your management and employees to look into those issues if somebody says, I cannot physically wear a mask because it could hurt me in some way.
Again, it's one of those things where you don't want to be silent. You have to
Mhm.
know what you're going to say.
Right.
You have to know where you're going, and that's really what we're talking about in this section. So Sarah, take us next.
Well,
The best advice.
yeah, I was just going to say, I think there are so many very challenging issues that we're working through right now. And I think what we're seeing in general is that anxiety is high, tempers are short, people are feeling very maybe open about their political opinions or where they're coming from, and they really feel a need to make sure that other people know what those might be. So, Michele, when we talked about it internally, we talked about the idea of being careful not to create a bandwagon moment, to be careful not to inauthentically say, you know what, I support this, or I don't support that, to just sort of jump on that bandwagon. From a public relations standpoint, how important do you think it is, like we saw in June, the Blackout Tuesday, where people, thousands of people all over the country posted a black square on their social media to say, I support Black Lives Matter, which is really inspiring in one sense, but I wonder if that's maybe evidence of that kind of bandwagon effect that, doesn't ring true. What do you think?
Well, y'all are asking tough questions. I mean, I've had this conversation a lot with a couple of my colleagues, and I have different thoughts. The question is, how much of the protesting is because it's the trendy thing to do?
Right.
How much of it is actually because people believe in the need for change? And I'm definitely not a bandwagon person, but I do think the more people that we have that support these things, the more people, there's critical mass, there's power in numbers. And so as a person who may be benefiting from some of this behavior, there's a part of me that says, yes, get on the bandwagon, because then it's out there and it's, we're loud and we're proud and we're going to make this happen. And I have to hope that people are not doing it in a contradiction to something that they innately believe. I feel like there's got to be some reason why they get on that bandwagon. I mean, like I said, there's a whole lot of things that I'm not one of those people. I mean, I tend to not be that person, but I'm not going to put something on my Facebook or whatever if I don't have some connection to it or don't have some belief. So a part of me thinks if that's your step, if that's your first step, then go for it, because then I have hope that you're going to take the next step and the next step and the next step. And it really is truly something that is just because of peer pressure or wanting to somehow be a part of what's trendy, you'll fall off. Or you get in there and you start listening and you start hearing and you start learning, and it becomes more than just because everybody else is doing it. So again, it's a hard question to answer, right? I don't want anyone to put up something that they don't believe in. But at the same time, I feel like if you're going to put it there, there's some reason why you're doing it. And I would hope that if even if it's you're doing it because this is your first step or because this is, you're the organizer, the more that we have out there, the better it is. Does that answer?
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of a conversation that I had with my girlfriend last week. She works for King County in Seattle. And I've known her for 20 years. She's African-American, working for the county on inclusion issues. And she went to her supervisor and said, we and some of the other members of your staff here would really like to hear from you. We'd really like to hear your, if not your support, at least what your thought process is on, how we are working toward diversity, working toward equity, working toward, better outcomes for the citizens of King County. And she said that he did eventually. I mean, he had to go away and think about it for a while, but he came back and said, well, this is my thought process and I'm looking for input. So from a PR, business PR perspective, that's what comes up in my head is, does it have to ring true? If a business goes out and says Black Lives Matter and there isn't a person of color anywhere in that business, or they don't interact with people of color, or they don't, you know what I mean? Like, is there a false note there?
No, I don't think it's false if they mean it. I think it's a matter of, okay, now you've put this out there. Are you acknowledging that? Are you acknowledging what's going on? And what are you doing about possibly changing that? So, if you're saying, I'm realizing Black Lives Matter and I'm ready to go and look at my business and, I think you said something about this earlier, Diane, and do an examination and figure out what is going on in our business that is the reason why we are an all-white corporation, organization, or whatever. And are there things that we can do to make those changes? So it's like you're saying Black Lives Matter, and you're publicly and very transparently saying, I'm looking at ourselves, I realize what I've got. We realize that this is something we need to support, and this is the evidence of how we're going to support it. So it's different if you said Black Lives Matter and somebody says, well, your business is, you have no diversity, and you say, well, yeah, but it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? So you have to kind of put your money where your mouth is.
Absolutely.
So how do I now, but I think transparency and humility are key. You have to come out and say, these are the things we're going to do. And it's not that you're going to just go grab the next Black person on the street and hire them, but you're going to literally look at your practices. You're going to look at, why is it that, what are the biases? What are the implicit biases that are at play? What is our marketing? Is our advertising for business, for employees? Is there something about it that we're not welcoming, that we're not opening? What do we need to do? And you start to make a plan.
Yep. And I think that leads really well into, we have a one sheet, a downloadable one sheet that you can get by going to mnccommunications.com. It's going to have an interview with Robyn D'angelo on it that was recently done by one of her dear friends who runs the Mercer Island Group, which is, when I saw that, that's when I thought, geez, geez Louise, I have the best lady in the world, and she's a friend of mine. I'm going to interview her. What a smart idea that is. And also it has this report on it, which is the Lead School of Business at CU Boulder, has a great report on Black Lives Matter responses, by some really large companies and corporations. And they've broken down things that you can do. So sometimes I think it's, how do we say what we want to say? And one of the things that I really learned in really looking at all this is if you take action, then you can talk about your action. And that's a smart way to not put your feet down, and to really talk about that we're doing something. So the first one that they have is invest in action. So look for causes, organizations that you can support financially. And then you talk about that and you encourage others, whether it's your employees, whether it's your customers, whether it's your clients, your colleagues, support it as well. Second one is to ritualize commitments. Now that's a long way of saying, I hate that term personally, but anyway, what they're basically saying is it just now? How are you going to incorporate this long term into your strategy for what you're going to do for your business? Ben and Jerry's came out in support of Black Lives Matter 4 years ago, and they have been talking about it for 4 years. That is a ritualized commitment. What's something that's much long term? So think about what is that going to be, and how are you going to continue to message about that and to let people know that this is where you're putting your support. That you outline your internal policies. So really showcase what you've changed at your company. And to go back to you, Michele, and what you said about the humility, I do like that whole idea of, I don't know what I don't know, but now that I'm learning, I'm going to change. I really like that. And that gives us, I think that takes some of our defensiveness away as Caucasians, as whites, that we don't know. And we're learning constantly. And for some of us, this is a much steeper learning curve right now than it's been for a very long time. To reevaluate your brand. And during the height of cultural change moments, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement, whether it's the Me Too movement, that you look at what your advertising or your promotion or your marketing is, and is it time to suspend that? Appropriate to be out there with whatever happy-go-lucky message that you had, you want to pull that first because it's not the right time. And then you want to consider what is it that you do want to say. So you want to think about that, and that's where you really fix and you retool your products. And is there something that you can do with your product or your service that would make it more inclusive? So thinking about that, I think, is really, really important. Sarah, take us on to our next topic.
Well, just a quick chat about next week, and we talked about this a minute ago. So the new mask mandate, and this mask controversy has been brewing for weeks or even a couple of months. And so next week we're going to do a deep dive into this mask wearing controversy. And now that it's a mandate, how should you be communicating to your employees, your customers, people that you may interact with in your place of business? And how do you, we always say, you know, a nice ask is better than a snarky demand. You know, how do you encourage compliance? And, you know, what do you do if you just have somebody who's flat not going to do it? You know, so thinking through all.
Or you have that altercation, right? That altercation.
Yeah, good heavens.
Which we're now seeing, unfortunately, every night on the nightly news. So what do you do in that scenario so that you de-escalate that situation?
Right. So Jordan, now we're going to look inside the business, right?
Yeah, we have to look at, you know, one of the things to acknowledge this and move forward is looking at how you're building diversity in your own team. So we found this quote from Robyn D'angelo. It's very thought-provoking.
I apologize, that's my fault. It's Robyn D'angelo, and I didn't fix that in this part of the script, Jordan. So that's not you, that's on me.
That's okay. So the quote, however, still rings true, and that is, if your management isn't diverse, the question is, how did it happen? So how did it happen? What is it that's keeping you from having a more diverse team? And Diane, I think, we can look internally at this. It's a
Right.
question that we have asked ourselves in the past, and all three of us have actually discussed, because we have 3 full-time people and we're all Caucasians. However, we have that in our expansion plan to expand the M&C diversity.
Right.
And I think it's one of those things where if you can expand that diversity and you can get that experience in the background of your team, it's only going to serve you better moving into the future, especially as where you're looking at things are in 2020. There's a really cool racial equality toolkit, and that was put out by the Government Alliance on Racial Equality that we just learned about. And Diane, you checked it out last night. And it's a really good resource, and it asks some really insightful questions on, what are you doing to develop or becoming involved to address inequality within your own company, or also bringing that diversity into your company. So it's a really fascinating discussion. And I think 2020 has really given us a good opportunity to dive deeper into that, especially with companies, and I think in some respect government too, at what we can do to become more diverse.
So, Michele, my question to you is a question that I've had for years, and I think so many business owners have, is yes, you're reaching out, but when it comes down to deciding who's going to get the job, how do you weigh the diversity issue versus who's best qualified? Now, the diverse person may be best qualified, and you don't have to make that decision. But in 2020, and where we are right now, how do you answer that? What guidance can you give us?
So, first of all, let me just say, so it's interesting, right? You have your minimum qualifications. You say, here's what you need to make this job, to do this job. I have a colleague who says, sometimes it's not necessarily sometimes you make the right decision versus what someone else may think is quote unquote a different decision. I don't want to use the word best because that's not good. If they meet the qualifications, and if they are, if they can do the job, then the question is, why not hire them if you have within your strategic plans and your goals to diversify your company? It's not to say that you, again, you don't hire just because they represent a marginalized group or an underrepresented group. And I don't particularly care for the term diverse persons, because we are all diverse persons.
Absolutely.
So the language is important. But when you're looking at it, unless there's a reason why you wouldn't hire them, why would you not? A lot of times the excuse you'll hear is, well, we had better qualified candidates. Well, why do you have a better qualified candidate? As Jordan was saying, why is this? Well, you may have a better qualified candidate because that qualified candidate had access to better education, they had access to more opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. So is there a reason why you would not give this person an opportunity? You know what I'm saying? And then what is the reason why you think this person is better qualified? Is it because they have 6 months more experience? I mean, what is your rationale? And is that rationale really okay? Because as we all know, when it comes down to those final 2 candidates, sometimes it's better fit. It has nothing to do with some of those metrics that are very tangible, right? And if you're saying that you're a company that is committed to diversifying, then at that point in time, the better fit is a candidate who's coming from who's going to help you meet that goal, right? Because that's part of what you're looking at. So again, not giving someone a job that they're not qualified for, but recognizing why is it that this one candidate has this advantage over the other? And it's about equity, not necessarily equal. It's about being equitable. And when you have this opportunity, are you able to maybe, help level that playing field, basically?
Absolutely, absolutely. We work with a number of companies, and for one in particular, the Lung Cancer Foundation of America. Sarah, do you want to talk about the Speakers Bureau and how intentional we were as to making sure that we had people of color, not diverse people, in the Speakers Bureau?
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think what the function of it is the outcome of making sure that there's a number of diverse experiences and viewpoints. Because what we were able to do, is really show that lung cancer is a problem that affects everyone. It is, it doesn't discriminate. It affects young women. It affects people of color. It affects everyone. And what it allows us to be able to do is talk to some of the audiences, connect with some of the audiences who may be affected by it in a really authentic way. And I'm thinking we've got 2 Spanish-speaking members, fluent Spanish speakers of the Speakers Bureau, one whose family is Puerto Rican. And so she has a slightly different, very slightly different version of Spanish, but speaks authentically to that audience. Whereas we have another member who is of Mexican descent. And so she's got, again, that very slightly different, it's kind of like a Southern dialect versus a Northern dialect of a Spanish. So it really helps make sure that we are connecting and outreaching authentically to lots of different audiences and making sure that the message about, lung cancer affects everyone is authentic, because we can show you, look, we can demonstrate very clearly that it affects everyone, and then we can communicate to those groups authentically. And I think that's just a function then of, I think one of the important reasons that diversity, diverse viewpoints, diverse backgrounds, diverse experience is so critical, especially when you're looking at something like a public relations campaign. You've got to be able to speak that language, I think.
And it's more than just ticking off the boxes. And Michele, do you want to talk a little bit about that? To me, this is an intentionality. Everyone that's in my group is a former television news person because of the experience and the way they think. And so that's an intentional thing, because there are tons of PR people out there who are very good, right? So when it comes to race, it's also an intentionality issue. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I'm glad you said that. I think it is important. This is an intentional conscious choice that you make, along with every other intentional conscious choice you make related to your company, right? And so, diversity does not just benefit the persons who are of these different backgrounds, right? It benefits all of us. I mean, if your company is made up of people just like you, why do you need them?
Right.
You want
May Jordan is nothing like me. I just want you to know. Nothing.
But just like you want, and what Sarah was saying, you want diversity of thought, you want diversity of ideas, and I would think for marketing in particular and PR work, I mean, every racial group is made up of diverse persons within their own group. Right. And every possible social issue, social problem, I think there's very few things that you would be putting out there where it's not impacting people from every race, every walk of life. So why would you not want people on your team who are going to be able to speak to how you might be able to meet those needs, speak their language, whether that's literal or figuratively, but how are you able to be able to communicate with those who are from these diverse groups? And if if you don't have those voices present in the room, if you don't have those voices at the table, you're going to miss the mark, because you're not going to have someone there to tell you whether or not it's going to be effective or may be effective. They may not know 100%, but they're going to have better idea than you might if you have absolutely no.
Well, it's also going to protect your brand, right? I mean, Jordan, talk a little bit about brand protection and how you think this would impact it.
Yeah, I mean, the more ideas you can have out there, and Michele, as you pointed out, the more voices and the more unique voices that you can have sitting at the table, to be making sure and be forward thinking about things that may impact your business, your brand in the future, that's inevitably going to help your company. So I think that we can look at this conversation of how things have changed in 2020 as a whole, not only to better ourselves socially, but also look internally at our business and brands to make sure we're making those conscious and thoughtful decisions. Because it not only is, hey, this is where we are and where we need to be, but also in the long run, this is going to better your company and further your company or further your brand.
Absolutely. And keep you from making those huge mistakes that we see, right, I swear, every week on TV, where you think, did no one look at this ad? Did they not think of the impact this was going to have on this specific group when they wrote this? How did that happen? So I find that to be very, very interesting. So finally, let's go into your internal work. I remember, Michele, our conversation about white privilege in the car. I don't know if you remember it, but defensive is the understatement for how I got. Because I did not come from a wealthy family. I worked 3 jobs and put myself through college, and immediately I went there. And it was fascinating to hear you explain to me what that term really meant and give me some explanations about it so that I could dial back a bit. Jennifer Long, who is an employment attorney and a discrimination complaint investigator, had this quote, which I talked a little bit about last week in our chat. She was interviewed on the Build a Better Agency podcast, and she says, the tool you need is humility. Like, your defense is down. You can say, that was the perspective I had before. It's not the perspective I have now. Here's what I'm going to do now with my new perspective. I think it gives white people a little bit of room to say, okay, not about being a good person. It's about what I didn't know that I didn't know.
Well,
yeah, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, please. I was just going to follow up along that line of, I went to an allyship workshop, and I walked in thinking, I'm a good person, and so I think I can probably figure this out on my own, but maybe I should go to this and see. And I was really surprised by, your good intentionality doesn't, it sort of takes you so far. And, I think that it's really powerful to sit and be open to that, to input, and to, looking at it from a different point of view. So I think, in just a slightly different way than Diane was talking about in a one-on-one conversation.
Where Michele was beating me up in the car, I will say.
Well, it had nothing to do with driving across the railroad track.
There would be that, yes.
There were those moments too. She told me to
the locomotive
step on it.
Car, but we had to get there. So anyway,
a long drive.
I think so. So I will speak to just saying that, Diane, you were talking earlier about knowing what you, not knowing what you don't know, right? So there's cultural competency, and there's cultural humility, and there's a person who's coined the term cultural compatibility, which is a really hard word to learn how to say.
Wow.
But it's bringing the two together. And so cultural competence is about knowledge. It's about, what do you need to know about these different groups? What do you need to What do you need? The knowledge that you need, and then cultural humility is about about being able to recognize that you don't know everything and you will never know
Right.
everything. You can never, none of us can ever be an expert on someone else's culture. So we have to recognize that. And, you want to be able to have that humility to say, to learn and to grow and to say, teach me, and allow others to be the expert, and not put them in a position, it's a very fine line, not put them in the position of having to teach you to where you don't have to do any of the work, but being able to hear what they're saying when they tell you, here's what I know, here's my experience, and being able to listen to that. And so it's really important that when you enter into these spaces that you're open to that. You can come in with some knowledge, but then you have to recognize that that knowledge you have may or may not be fitting to that person who's sitting in front of you right then and right there. Because we all have these intersecting identities. Everybody that is African American is not the same. Everybody who is Latinx is not the same. Everybody who is white is not the same. And
Very
so
true.
we have to recognize that we have some knowledge. We go into these spaces with this knowledge, and then we allow these others, these people who are different from us, to help fill in some of those gaps and give us more about who they are and what they know. And if they're doing their part, they're going to tell you, I can't represent my whole group. I cannot sit here and speak for all African Americans. I can tell you my experience, and I can tell you what maybe my friends and my family, but know that there are other experiences out there that may be different from mine, and don't expect my experience to be their experience. And so it's definitely an ongoing intentional work. And you have to be, it's the cultural humility piece of this is, how do you come to the table? Do you come to the table as with an openness, with a willingness to learn, a willingness to be told that you might be wrong and that you might need to correct some things?
I'm not really good with that part. I'm still working on that part.
And maybe you do have to go away and think about it a minute, but being willing to hear that versus coming at it as, well, I've read all these books and I know all of this and I'm done. So it's really combining the two and being able to gather the knowledge, but also recognize that in the moment, in that moment in time, you have to be open and hear what people are telling
I
you.
think that's the best advice I've heard of all the stuff that I've read and I've listened to, because it does, you look at the New York Times bestseller list right now, and I think it's the top 5 books are all on this cultural competency discussion, right? And how many people will read the books and will then feel like they've done their work and they're done?
Right.
And the reality is, while it's a cultural discussion, you may remember us talking about adoptive families and your impression of adoptive families, interviewed the adoptive families who have these children that have such serious mental health issues and what they go through and how invested they are in the kids. I just think that judging is something that has become so commonplace in our society right now that if we can all step back a little bit and say, we don't know what we don't know. That's true, and we're going to try and be better.
And Diane, I just want to say that is such a great example. For those that don't know, I have years of experience as an adoption social worker. I am now an adoptive parent. I don't even know if you know that, Diane.
I didn't know that. Congratulations.
I'm an adoptive parent. I adopted a 38-year-old child, but he's a kiddo that's been in our life for many years. But at the time we were doing our work, I've not been an adoptive parent, and even with the experience that I have, I know that it is not the same. And so when I talk about, and adoption and adoptive families and what have you. I'm coming at it from the perspective of a worker. I'm coming at it from the perspective of someone who has been on that side of the fence. And so the fact that when we went out and did our work together, and I tell people this all the time, it was great because you sat there as the adoptive parent. And while, again, you can't tell me every adoptive parent's experience, you gave me insight when I would hear things that they would not fit my paradigm of what I thought adoptive parents and adoptive parenting was. And I could hear you give me insight into that because you are the expert more so than I am, because you've been there, you've done that, you lived that day in and day out. I have not. So I have to be humble enough to allow you to teach me. And yeah, and you and I are very much alike. I don't like to be wrong either, but but I have to be willing to admit when I'm wrong, and then I adapt my behavior based on this ongoing, ever going, lifelong learning process.
I've been thinking since I've been looking at all of this great content and the links and all of that, again, is in that downloadable. What's ringing in my head is my aunt has said this for years. She's like, you have to get out of judgment and into curiosity.
There you go.
And I'm just like, you know what? I think that's just a great place to start. Get out of judgment and into curiosity. But Jordan, the other thing that has been ringing in my head as we've been talking is this continued use of some of the words that you have worked into, the 4 C's document, some other things that we have, but one of those is empathy. And I think that just some of the same words keep popping up, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, we have seen that, really throughout a lot of our discussions in 2020, being empathetic toward your fellow human, because we're all in a pretty rough spot right now. And, while the can of worms that COVID has opened up for us here is giving us an opportunity to respect one another through that. But in addition to it, the Black Lives Matter movement too. In order to learn, we have to be empathetic. We have to have humility, and we have to be willing to continually learn and continually grow. And I think that's so important because no big change happens overnight. So we're going to continue to learn more about this. We have to continue to be open to learn more about it too. And if you're a business owner watching this video, I think those are some great first steps that you can take to continue this conversation in a really thoughtful way.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Michele Hanna, Michele, my friend, thank you for taking the time today, because I do think you bring such a beautiful perspective. What I remember most is our great discussions. It didn't matter, we were on 2 different sides. That's the important thing. So I want you guys to go and download the one sheet that we put together, where we're going to go over how no messaging is a message, how to respond appropriately, and actually give you examples of what different people did, suggestions for how to increase diversity in your workplace and to be more intentional, and then some things on self-reflection, listening to people who have different points of view, being empathetic, having that humility, and being open to it. And we hope you've enjoyed this as much as we have. So have a wonderful rest of your Friday.